Hello, everyone. My name is Mete Uysal. I'm a PhD student from Turkey. Today, I will present the preliminary findings of my PhD studies, which is focused on leadership, identification, populism, and pro-immigration in Turkey. Let's start with populism. Populism is a pejorative term which is used to describe leftist presidents in Latin America, such as Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez, rising right-wing populist parties in Europe, such as French National Front, the UK Independence Party, or Alternative for Deutschland, and both Democrat and Republican political actors in US, which we witnessed in the last election this year. Both Biden and Trump used very intense populist discourse. Despite all these context-specific and undescribable nature of populism, it is characterized by nativist ideologies and anti-immigration in almost all countries. In addition to this, scholars suggest that charismatic populist leadership enriched the populist rhetoric on nationalism and migrant policies. Accordingly, populism is so related to interaction between followers and the leaders. Nevertheless, little is known about the leadership and social identity process that's closely related to populist attitudes and how these are related to migrant policies. Social identity approach of leadership describe the leadership as a group process that is jointly produced by the leaders and followers as the members of the same social group. Therefore, populist attitudes are seen as closely related to these group dynamics rather than the sole characteristics of the charismatic leaders. Identity leadership model developed by Haslam and colleagues suggests that populist or not, uh, influential leaders are play key role in crafting sense of us, bringing people together by inducing a shared social identity, clarifying and shaping people's understanding of what group represent by defining the in-group norm. But distinctively, populist discourse and populist leadership is an effort to craft a broad but vague sense of us, bring people together by inducing a teen-centered and deprivation-focused shared social identity. And we already know that from social identity and social psychology research in general, national identification play a crucial role in the relationship between um, minority group members and immigrants. But in the context of populism, there is more than that. Populists consider that politics are war between good versus evil, most commonly ordinary people versus elites. The separation of good ordinary people versus evil elites may be swiftly transformed into members of our nation versus non-native agents by effect of national identification through an effective identity leadership process. Before the maths and findings, I want to present the research context, which is Turkey in terms of populism, leadership, and anti-immigration. Lewis and colleagues showed that although Erdogan was not elected through a populist rhetoric, he increased his populist discourse and policies between 2007 and 2011. And at the end, he seems one of the most populist leaders in the Europe dated from 2004, as you've seen. Moreover, Turkey has endured the largest increase in populist rhetoric across 40 countries. However, there is a unique situation in Erdogan's populist rhetoric. In general, anti-immigration is placed at the center of the speech of populist leader. Although nationalist populist discourse generally occupies a really large place in Erdogan's speech, there has been no anti-immigration. On the contrary, Erdogan has boasted in many times how Turkey welcomed the sovereign immigrants, how our peoples embraced their guests. So, in spite of Erdogan's pro-immigrant discourses, Turkish people who have given support for Erdogan overwhelmingly have strong nationalist attitudes and anti-immigrant sentiments. Considering Erdogan's immigrant policies, endorsing Erdogan as an influential leader may have a complicated impact on the attitudes towards Syrian immigrants in Turkey. So in two cross-sectional survey studies, we investigate the role of national identification, identity leadership, and populist attitudes in support for pro-immigrant policies among minority group members in Turkey. So we hypothesize that stronger identification with Turkish identity is likely to predict lower support for pro-immigrant policies. On the other hand, stronger support for the populist political leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is likely to predict higher support for pro-immigrant policies. So we distribute the link of the survey on social media. Data were collected in March 2020. 190 Turkish participants participate in our survey, and I skipped the information on the demographics and the measures due to time limitation. A linear regression analysis was conducted to test the effects of national identification, populist attitudes, and identity leadership on support for pro-immigrant policies in Turkey. While national identification predict the endorsement of the pro-immigrant policies negatively, identity leadership predict it positively. However, populist attitudes did not predict it at all. Given the fact that populism is a teen-centered ideology that enriched with nativism, we believe that populist attitudes might appear as a moderator between national identification and support for pro-immigrant policies rather than a predictor. Accordingly, it would be necessary to extend these findings and test the moderator role of populist attitudes with a larger sample. We aim to conduct a second survey study and test the moderated mediation model. We expect that the impact of endorse the populist political leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, would be bidirectional. Specifically, we hypothesize that while identity leadership is likely to predict higher support for pro-immigrant policies, it would be predict lower support for pro-immigrant policies through increased national identification. We also hypothesize that the path between national identification and support for pro-immigrant policies would be moderated by populist attitudes. We collected data from student sample in study 2. Data were collected in April 2020, and we recruited over 300 Turkish citizens. We first test the mediating role of national identification using highest process macro model 4. Results indicate that identity leadership was significant predictor of support for pro-immigrant policies and national identity. And national identity was a significant predictor of support for pro-immigrant policies. But more importantly, identity leadership was still a significant predictor of support for pro-immigrant policies once national identification was included in the model. The indirect effect was tested using a bootstrap estimation approach, and results indicate that negative indirect effect of identity leadership on support for pro-immigrant policies. I believe that this negative indirect effect, despite the positive direct effect, tell us many things about the bidirectional impact of Erdogan's populist and nationalist leadership on Turkish people attitudes toward Syrian immigrants. And we later conducted a moderated mediation model, moderated mediation analysis using highest process macro model 14 this time. The results indicate that interaction between national identification and populist attitudes was significant, suggesting populist attitudes moderate the effects of national identification on support for pro-immigrant policies. National identification was not significant at below one standard deviation of populist attitudes, but was significant both at mean and at above one standard deviation of populist attitudes, supporting our moderation hypothesis. This figure reflects that while the higher national identity is closely related to less support for pro-immigrant policies, this effect can peak when combined with populist attitudes. So these results suggest that identifying with Turkish identity is associated with more negative attitudes towards pro-immigrant policies. Moreover, people who perceive Erdogan more prototypical and successful identity entrepreneur tend to support his pro-immigrant policies. And study 2 found support for moderating effect of populist attitudes on national identification, on the relation between national identification and support for pro-immigrant policies. But why we did support for our moderation hypothesis? The main reason behind this finding is that populism is a team-centered ideology that corresponds and enrich the nativist ideologies. While the greater national identity is closely related to negative attitudes towards immigrants, this effect can peak when combined with populist attitudes. This finding is complementing the discussion about populism, which claimed that populism becomes more concrete when combining the other tick-centered ideologies. This also shows why the success of populism in recent years has created such concerns. Populism is not only an emerging identity, ideology that threatens some important democratic values, but it also escalates the adverse impact of deep-seated ideologies such as nationalism. And furthermore, our findings showed that the bi-directional impact of Erdogan on attitudes towards immigrants. Although Erdogan has maintained the pro-immigrant discourse for a decade, major parts of Turkish society have developed antipathy or hostility towards immigrants in last years. Representative polls showed that 80% of Turkish people think that the government should send back the Syrian immigrants from their country. Although supporting Erdogan related to greater support for pro-immigrant policies in Turkey, the indirect effect of support for Erdogan through an increased level of national identification suggests that Erdogan's leadership decreased the supporting pro-immigrant policies in the end. In brief, the increased nationalist discourse of Erdogan causes the loss of people's support for pro-immigrant policies. I think my time is up. I'm looking forward to meet with you at Q&A session. You can send mail to me for any question or feedback, and have a lovely conference. Thank you.